The pen was a nice one. Heavy, matte black, the kind that came in a velvet box. Someone had set it beside the signature line like a gift. Vanessa looked at it for a long time. The conference room was on the 14th floor of a building in Tyson's Corner, and through the floor-to-ceiling windows the afternoon light came in flat and colorless, the way it does in November when the sky has nothing left to offer. There were 8 people in the room. 7 of them were looking at her. The 8th, her husband, Park Juno, was looking at the table. The documents in front of her were 42 pages. She knew because she had counted them when the paralegal slid them across the glass surface with both hands, the way you offer something to someone you are slightly afraid of. She had not touched them yet. Vanessa. Mrs. Park Sunja's voice was measured, careful, the way it always was when she wanted something. She was seated across the table in a charcoal suit, her silver hair swept back, her hands folded. We need this today. You understand what happens to the family if you don't. Vanessa let the sentence settle. She had been waiting for it, in one form or another, for 11 years. She picked up the pen, turned it once in her fingers, set it back down. I understand perfectly, she said. That's why we're going to talk first. 3 people at the table shifted in their chairs. The family lawyer, a compact man named Gerald Kim who had been retained by the Parks for 20 years, opened his mouth and closed it. Juno's hand moved on the table, not toward her, not away. Just moved, like a man reaching for something that was no longer there. Vanessa folded her hands in her lap, where no one could see them, and pressed her grandmother's pearl ring against her palm. Outside, a plane crossed the sky. She had sat in her car for 45 minutes before coming upstairs. The garage was half empty on a Wednesday afternoon, her silver sedan pulling into a spot near the elevator bank with the mechanical ease of a body doing what it knows how to do while the mind is somewhere else entirely. She had turned off the engine and sat in the silence and looked at her own reflection in the dark screen of her phone. She did not call anyone. She did not pray, though she was a woman who prayed. She did not cry, because there was nothing left in this particular situation that merited tears. Tears were for loss. What she was walking into was not a loss. It was a reckoning, and there is a difference between those two things that most people never learn to feel. She had pressed the pearl ring once, the way her grandmother Ruthie used to press her own thumb against the center of her palm before walking into any room where someone was going to try to make her small. You already know what you know, Ruthie used to say. Walk in like you know it. Vanessa had gotten out of the car, smoothed the front of her blazer, and gone upstairs. To understand how she ended up at that table, at the head of it, which was never where she was supposed to be, you would need to go back 11 years. And then back further than that. You would need to go back to a kitchen table in Baltimore, where a 10-year-old girl watched her grandmother do something she would not understand until she was 47 years old. You would need to start there, and then move forward slowly. Because that is how damage works, and that is how survival works. And in this story they are tangled up together so completely that you cannot separate them without losing the whole thread. So that is where we begin. Not in that conference room. Not yet. The kitchen table in Ruthie Caldwell's house on Elwood Avenue was covered in a floral oilcloth that had been wiped down so many times the pattern had faded at the center, where everyone's elbows went. On a Tuesday afternoon in October of 1987, a man in a brown suit sat on one side of it with a folder of papers, and Ruthie Caldwell sat on the other side. And between them, standing at the edge of the doorframe with a glass of sweet tea she'd been sent to fetch and then forgotten to deliver, was Vanessa. 10 years old. Eyes wide. Very still. The man was explaining things slowly. He had the careful diction of someone who had decided before arriving that the woman across from him would need things repeated. He was wrong, and Ruthie knew he was wrong, and she let him finish anyway. Let him use up every word of his prepared explanation before she pulled the folder toward herself and turned to page 3 and said, "The lot line on the east boundary is described wrong here. It should be 42 feet, not 38. I have the survey." She produced the survey from the pocket of her house robe. She had been carrying it the entire time. The man in the brown suit looked at the paper, looked at Ruthie, and blinked. "I'll need to have this corrected before I sign it," Ruthie said, in the same even tone she used for everything, for discussing the weather and for telling bill collectors she'd pay when she had it. "How long will that take?" Vanessa had stood in that doorway for the rest of the meeting with the sweet tea going warm in her hand, watching her grandmother dismantle every assumption the man had walked in with, and she had understood almost none of the legal specifics and every single thing that mattered. 26 years later, Vanessa Caldwell drove her then-boyfriend Park Juno down I-95 on a Saturday in March and showed him the Baltimore warehouse for the first time. It was not beautiful. It was a 2-story cinderblock structure in a light industrial neighborhood, with aluminum roll-up doors and a loading dock that needed resurfacing and a faded sign above the entrance that said Caldwell Storage in the kind of black vinyl lettering that peels at the edges in cold weather. But Ruthie had bought it in 1991 with the rental income from 2 row houses she'd owned since 1974, and she had paid it off by 1998, and when she died she had left it to her granddaughter in a will that was clear and simple and witnessed by a notary and locked in a fireproof box in the closet, because Ruthie Caldwell had not trusted the world to do right by the people she loved, so she had done right by them herself. She bought this on cleaning money, Vanessa said. They were standing in the empty main floor, their voices coming back at them from the concrete walls. She cleaned offices 5 nights a week for 31 years. She never missed a mortgage payment. Juno walked the length of the space slowly, looking up at the ceiling, the high windows, the steel beams. "What are you going to do with it?" he asked. "I don't know yet. I've been renting it to a wholesaler, but the lease is up in the fall." She ran her hand along one of the cinderblock walls, feeling the cool, rough texture. "It's the only thing I've ever owned that no one gave me, that no one helped me get. It's just mine." Juno came back to where she was standing and took her hand. Not performatively. Just took it the way you take hold of something you understand the value of. "Then we'll build something real with it," he said. She looked at his face and believed him. Completely, without reservation, the way you can believe someone when you are not yet old enough in the relationship to know which of their words are true and which ones are just the shape of what they want. She would think about this moment many times over the years to come. Not with bitterness. With something more complicated than that. The first time Vanessa met Mrs. Park Sunja was on a Friday evening in April, 6 months into the relationship. Juno had described his mother as formal but warm once she knows you. A description that Vanessa filed away carefully, because those 2 qualities were not always compatible, and the sequence mattered. The Park family home in Annandale was a large colonial with a front garden that was very tidy and a foyer with polished hardwood floors and a shelf of framed family photographs arranged in order of age, the oldest faces at the top, the younger ones descending, so that walking in felt faintly like walking into a history. Juno's father, Mr. Park Seongman, greeted them at the door with a handshake and a smile that was genuine. His mother came from the kitchen a few moments later, still in her apron, and looked at Vanessa with the steady, evaluative gaze of a woman who was going to make her own determination about this situation in her own time, on her own terms. "Juno speaks well of you," she said. Which was not a welcome, but it was what it was. Dinner was set beautifully. The table had 8 dishes, each brought from the kitchen in a specific order, and the conversation flowed in 2 languages, English for inclusion, Korean for depth, and Vanessa sat in the chair she'd been directed to and ate what was placed in front of her and said all the right things about the food, which she meant, because it was extraordinary. Toward the end of the meal, Mrs. Park moved around the table with a ceramic pot, refreshing everyone's barley tea. She poured for her husband. She poured for Juno. She poured for Juno's younger sister Jiyeon, who was home from graduate school and who watched everything in the room with careful, unreadable eyes. She poured for the aunt and the uncle who had come for dinner. She reached Vanessa's cup. She set the pot down. She returned to her seat. She did not look at Vanessa's cup. She did not look at Vanessa. She simply sat down and picked up her own tea and continued the conversation about Juno's cousin's new apartment in Bethesda, and no one at the table blinked, and Vanessa's cup sat empty, and Vanessa sat beside it and said nothing. It was such a small thing. It was such a precise thing. Juno, across the table, had not seen it. Or if he had decided, in the half-second it would have taken to remedy, not to. Vanessa reached for the ceramic pot herself, poured her own tea, set the pot back down, lifted the cup and drank. And that was the first lesson this family taught her. In this house, you pour for yourself, or you go without. She chose to pour. And she told herself that was enough. The hanbok was deep green silk with gold embroidery along the collar. Vanessa had found it at a shop in Koreatown on H Street run by a woman named Mrs. O, who had spent 45 minutes with her going through fabrics and who had said, when Vanessa explained she was attending her first chuseok with her husband's family, "You should wear something you feel beautiful in. The rest takes care of itself." She had felt beautiful in it. That was the thing she would remember afterward. Not what happened, but how she had felt driving to the park house that September afternoon, the silk heavy and cool against her legs, her back straight, Juno in the passenger seat talking about the highway traffic, and the early fall light coming through the windshield gold and easy. She had spent 2 weeks preparing. She had read 3 articles about chuseok. She had watched a documentary. She had practiced the deep bow, the kyunjil, in the bathroom mirror, feeling slightly absurd about it and doing it anyway, because she believed that doing the thing correctly was a form of respect, and that respect was something she gave without condition to anyone who might eventually give it back. They arrived, and the house was full. 2 aunts, an uncle, 3 cousins, Jiyeon, and Mr. and Mrs. Park, and the smell of John, the savory pancakes that had been frying since morning, coming from the kitchen in warm, oily waves. Vanessa stepped through the door and bowed correctly, and Mr. Park nodded at her with something like approval, and Mrs. Park looked at the hanbok and said, "You look nice," in the brisk way of someone crossing an item off a list. She went to help in the kitchen. She was redirected gently by Mrs. Park's older sister, Juno's Aunt Myung-suk, who smiled at her and said, "You go relax, we have plenty of hands," and closed the kitchen door. Vanessa stood in the hallway. The door was not locked. It was just closed. She found Jiyeon in the living room, scrolling her phone, legs folded under her on the armchair. "Is there something I can do?" Vanessa asked. Jiyeon looked up. There was a brief pause, the kind where someone is making a decision about how honest to be. "You can set the side table in the dining room," she said. "No one's done it yet." So Vanessa set the side table. She folded cloth napkins into careful rectangles and placed the small plates in the right order, and when she was done she stood at the kitchen threshold and listened to the women inside. The rapid exchange of Korean, the laughter at something she could not follow, the sound of the cast iron pan going down on the burner, and she understood with a particular clarity of someone standing outside a closed door that she was not being malicious excluded. She was being structurally excluded. The result was the same. But understanding the mechanism mattered. It meant she knew what she was dealing with. Later, before the food was served, Juno's Aunt Myung-suk found Jiyeon in the hallway and said something in rapid Korean, not quietly enough, not realizing, or not caring, that sound carries in an old colonial house, through the doorways and into the dining room where Vanessa was finishing the table. She didn't understand the words, but she understood Jiyeon's face. Jiyeon's response was flat and brief, and she did not look in Vanessa's direction, which meant she knew Vanessa was there. 20 minutes later, Jiyeon came to find her and said, with careful nonchalance, "My aunt says you look very enthusiastic." Vanessa did not allow herself a single second of hurt. She smiled, not a performance, not a mask, but the specific smile of a woman who has decided that this information will be stored, not used, for now. "Good," she said. "I feel enthusiastic." Jiyeon looked at her for a moment. Then one corner of her mouth moved. Not quite a smile. She turned and went back to the living room. When the family moved to sit, Vanessa carried 2 dishes from the side table to the main spread, just placed them there, among the family food, because they were food and the table had room. She did not announce it. She did not make it a gesture. Jiyeon, without looking up from the plate she was arranging, slid a serving of John from the family's pile and set it directly beside the dish Vanessa had brought. Not touching it. Just next to it. Like a small, wordless statement of adjacency. It took 2 seconds. She did not look at Vanessa when she did it. Vanessa noticed everything. In the car home, Juno reached for her hand. "You were amazing tonight." She looked out the window at the passing streetlights. "Was I?" she said. Not a question. He heard what it wasn't and chose, in the half-breath of that moment, to hear it as one. "Yeah," he said. "You really were." She let him hold her hand. She did not say what she was thinking, which was, "I worked for 2 weeks to walk into that room and I was directed out of the kitchen in 60 seconds and no one said my name at the table once." She did not say it because she was not yet ready to say it, and because she was still telling herself that patience was a virtue and not a down payment with no return date. That night, she folded the hanbok with both hands along the original creases. She wrapped it in tissue and put it in its box. She slid the box to the back of the closet, behind the winter coats. Then she opened her laptop, went to YouTube, and typed, "How to learn Korean for beginners." She pressed play. No one ever knew. The morning Juno asked her to sign the papers, he made eggs. This was a detail she would not forget, that it was a Tuesday, that the light in the kitchen was the thin gray-white of early February, that he had made scrambled eggs with the sharp cheddar she liked and a cup of coffee she didn't ask for and a manner about him that was a half-degree too careful, too easy, that she recognized in the specific way you recognize a thing you have been trained by experience to recognize even when you'd rather not. He set the plate in front of her and sat across from her and talked about the business for a few minutes. An expansion, a new product line, a credit opportunity that was time-sensitive, and then he said, there's a way to finance part of it using the Baltimore property. Just as collateral. Temporary. To close a gap in the credit line before the end of the quarter. She set her fork down. She looked at him. Tell me exactly how it's structured, she said. He explained it. He was not evasive. She would give him that, then and later. He told her it was an informal collateral agreement, not a full transfer. He told her the family lawyer had drafted the framework but that the credit line closed in 36 hours and Gerald Kim was traveling and couldn't execute a formal document in time. He told her the collateral position would be released once the credit line was refinanced in 6 months. Vanessa was quiet for a moment. She had spent 7 years at a regional bank assessing precisely these kinds of arrangements. The speed, the informality, the short timeline, the trusted party framing. She knew what this structure was. She knew what it left open. She also knew that she was being asked to trust her husband in the way you are only asked to trust someone when the legal protections have been set aside and all that remains is the word. The informal structure leaves the deed relationship ambiguous, she said. I know, he said. Gerald will clean it up when he's back. She looked at him. He was not hiding anything. He believed what he was saying with the sincere conviction of a man who had never needed to read the fine print on anything in his family's possession because the family had always closed ranks around its own assets. It was not malice. It was assumption, the quiet, deep assumption that things would work out because they were family and family held. She was part of the family. That was the point. That was what she was being told by this plate of eggs and this cup of coffee and his steady eyes. She picked up the pen. She thought of Ruthie at that kitchen table in 1987. Never put your name on something you don't intend to own. She signed. She signed because she had told herself that love was the exception to professional judgment, that trust between married people was its own form of legal protection, that the thing her grandmother was warning against was strangers, not husbands. She signed because the alternative, pulling back, demanding a formal structure, treating her own marriage like a contract negotiation, felt like a kind of violence against what they had built together. She signed, and she handed the papers back. And she told herself that was the reasonable thing to do. 3 days later, her phone rang with a number she didn't recognize. Mrs. Caldwell Park? This is Gerald Kim, attorney for the Park family. I'm calling to confirm receipt of the signed collateral documents and to thank you on behalf of the Parks for your cooperation with the business matter. She stood in the hallway of her own home and listened to the phrase on behalf of the Parks and felt something shift in her chest, quiet and tectonic, the way things shift when the ground moves before you hear it. The Park family's use of the property, Gerald continued, will be documented in our files as of this week. The Park family's use. Not the collateral agreement. Not the temporary financing arrangement. The family's use. I'll need a copy of the full documentation, she said. Of course. I'll have my assistant send it over. She hung up and stood in the hallway for a moment. Then she went to the kitchen drawer where she kept a yellow legal pad, and she wrote one line at the top of the first page, and she put the pad back in the drawer and closed it. The line said, "Keep track." 6 weeks later, at the first family dinner following the credit line closing, Juno's father raised a glass of macchiali, the cloudy, lightly sweet rice wine that came out only for occasions that meant something, poured always by the eldest present, Mr. Park filling each cup himself, moving around the table with a bottle held in both hands because that is how you pour for people you are honoring. He poured for his wife. He poured for Juno. He poured for Jiyeon, for the aunt and uncle, for the two cousins. He set the bottle down. He lifted his glass. To Park Industries, he said. And to the foundation our family has built together. Everyone raised a glass. Vanessa reached for the bottle and poured her own. She raised it with everyone else. She said nothing. She ate the dinner. She helped clear the plates, because no one had told her not to. And she thought, my name built part of that foundation. My grandmother built part of it. And not one person in this room knows that, or cares. It was the kind of thought you can either metabolize or let sit in you like a stone. She had not yet decided which. There was a Sunday in May, 2 years after the deed signing, when they went to the farmer's market on King Street because Juno wanted tomatoes for a sauce he was making, and Vanessa wanted nothing in particular except to be somewhere that was not the house. It was a good morning. Legitimately good, without the performance of goodness that she was getting better at recognizing. The market was full of people, and the light was that particular Alexandria May light, warm, slightly hazy, everything slightly overexposed, and Juno found his tomatoes and then spent 4 minutes in an increasingly committed argument with a vendor about whether a specific squash was a zucchini or a courgette. They're the same thing, Vanessa said. They are not the same thing, Juno said, with the specific intensity of a man who did not have strong opinions about many things but was prepared to die on this one. Park Juno, she said. One is English and one is French. They are the same vegetable. The texture is different. The texture. She looked at him. He was looking at the squash with complete sincerity. She started laughing, and once she started she couldn't stop, and he looked up and saw her face and started too, and the vendor watched both of them with a patient, mildly baffled expression of someone who had seen stranger things at a Saturday market and would see stranger still. They walked home with the tomatoes and the disputed squash and 2 cups of coffee, and his hand found hers at some point and she let it stay there, and for those 2 hours she did not think about the yellow legal pad in the kitchen drawer or the words the Park family's use or the empty teacup at the dinner table 3 years ago. She just walked, and the morning was just a morning, and he was just her husband. She would keep this memory. She would return to it, later, in harder moments. Not as evidence that everything was fine, but as evidence that there was something real inside the marriage that was worth the difficulty of what she was beginning to understand she was going to have to do. What she did was wait 7 months. And then she set the table differently. No candles. No music. Chicken and rice. Something plain, something that was just food without atmosphere or implication. She set Juno's plate across from hers, and she set a piece of paper, folded in half, beside his water glass, and she sat down and waited for him to come home. He came in at 7:15 and kissed her cheek and looked at the table and at the folded paper, and something in his face went very still. They sat down. She pushed the paper toward him. He opened it. It was handwritten, her precise, small handwriting, the handwriting of a woman who had taken notes in every meeting of her career. A list. The Baltimore property. The collateral agreement. The 11 corporate events she had hosted. The 4 business trips she'd managed logistics for. The 3 years she had been in the workforce and the year she had agreed to stop being in it. The loans they had co-signed, her credit score lending its weight. The family dinners. The holidays. The labor, itemized. Juno read it. She watched his face while he read it. She watched him get to the bottom and start at the top again. I need you to look at that list, she said, and tell me what the return is. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, someone's car passed on the street. You want to go back to work, he said. She looked at him. That's not what I asked. He looked at the list again. She could see him trying to find a way to respond that answered the question she was asking, and she could see him not finding it, not because he was evasive but because he had never been asked to add it up before. No one had ever handed him the number. He had moved through the years of their marriage the way you move through a room where someone has been maintaining the temperature. You are comfortable, you notice if it changes, but you do not think about the mechanism. The silence went on for a full minute. Maybe longer. She reached across the table and took the list back. Folded it. Put it in the pocket of her cardigan. I'll give you time to think about it, she said. She did not say it with anger. She said it with the flat, clear tone of a woman who has run out of a particular kind of patience. Not the patience that endures, but the patience that waits for someone else to do the right thing. She had used all of that up. What she had left was a different kind, the kind that acts. What neither of them said, sitting in that kitchen on a Tuesday night with the plain chicken getting cold between them, was the thing that was actually true, that she had not made this list for him. She had made it for herself. To see what she had given. To hold it in her own hands and know that she had not imagined it. She had not imagined any of it. The call that changed everything came on a Wednesday afternoon in October, 8 months after the kitchen table conversation that Juno had still not answered. Vanessa was at her desk. She had been doing consulting work, small contracts, nothing that required explanation to the family, when a number she didn't recognize showed on her phone. Area code 571. Northern Virginia. Mrs. Caldwell Park? A man's voice, careful, slightly formal. My name is David Yoon. I've been retained by Park Industries to perform a full asset review in connection with a restructuring matter. I'm calling because my review has surfaced a documentation issue involving a property in Baltimore County, a warehouse at 1140 Linden Industrial Drive, and I believe you're the person I need to speak with. She closed her laptop. I'm listening, she said. He explained it the way attorneys explain things when they have found something they did not expect to find. Methodically, with precision, and with the particular care of someone who wants the listener to understand that he is not the architect of this situation. The collateral agreement Vanessa had signed 4 years ago was, as she had noted at the time, informally structured. But the problem was not the informality of that document. The problem, or, depending on how you held it, the solution, was what the informality had failed to resolve. The original deed on the Baltimore property had been structured by Ruthie Caldwell in 1991 with a specific clause that Ruthie had insisted on and that the man in the brown suit had probably not read carefully. A beneficial interest provision that meant the property could not be fully transferred, encumbered, or disposed of without the active, formal consent of the named beneficiary. Ruthie had put it there on purpose. Vanessa had not known it was there because no one had told her and she had not thought to look. She had the deed, she had the survey, she had the notarized will, and she had assumed that was the whole of it. It was not the whole of it. Ruthie, who had spent 31 years cleaning offices in a city that did not protect people who looked like her, had built a lock into her granddaughter's inheritance that required a specific key. And the key was Vanessa's signature. Not a collateral agreement, not a business document, but a formal, witnessed, notarized consent from the beneficiary named on the original deed. Without it, the restructuring sale could not close. The investor would not proceed. The acquisition that threatened to strip the Parks of operational control of their own company could not be stopped. The family, David Yoon said, with obvious discomfort, has been operating under the assumption that the property was fully available to the business. I understand, Vanessa said. They were not. No one was aware that the deed structure. Mr. Yoon. Her voice was not unkind. I understood you the first time. A brief silence. I'll need to speak with my own attorney before any further discussion, she said. I'll be in touch within 24 hours. She hung up. She sat at her desk in the October afternoon light and did not move for a long time. She thought about Ruthie at the kitchen table in 1987, producing the survey from the pocket of her house robe. I'll need to have this corrected before I sign it. She thought about the way Ruthie had known to carry the survey. How she had not trusted the man to have gotten it right. How she had checked. Ruthie had put a lock on this deed 23 years ago, and she had never mentioned it to Vanessa, and Vanessa had never found it, and neither had the Park family lawyer, and for 4 years the Parks had been running their business on property they did not fully control. The woman they had redirected away from the kitchen. The woman whose cup they had skipped. The woman whose name had not been in the toast. The woman who had been called a guest in the language of 100 small omissions. She was, in the language of the law, a co-owner. She picked up her phone and called a woman she'd worked with at the bank in 2008, a real estate attorney named Phyllis Moore, who picked up on the second ring and said, Vanessa, I've been waiting for this call. Have you? Vanessa said. Well, Phyllis said. Not this call. But a call. You know what I mean. Vanessa almost smiled. I need to know exactly where I stand. Then let's find out, Phyllis said. Start from the beginning. Vanessa took a breath. She opened the laptop. She pulled up the deed documents she had scanned and saved in a folder she'd been maintaining, quietly, without occasion, for the last 4 years. Keep track, she had written on the first page of the yellow legal pad. She had kept track. Every document, every date, every name. And she thought, for just a moment, before she began, "Thank you, Grandma." Then she began. If you have ever had to stand completely alone to protect your dignity, and you did it anyway, this channel was built for you. Subscribe. There are more stories like this one, and every single one of them is for you. The evening Juno came home knowing everything had changed. He found her in the kitchen making soup. Not just any soup. Mayak guk, the dark, silky seaweed broth that his mother made on birthdays and after illness and in the weeks following childbirth, when a body needed to be rebuilt from the inside. He had grown up eating it on every significant morning of his life. He knew exactly what it meant to make it, and for whom it was made, and the specific tenderness of the gesture. She was making it for herself. He stood in the doorway and watched her for a moment before she turned around. The kitchen smelled of sesame and the faint oceanic brine of the dried seaweed she'd rehydrated in a bowl on the counter. Her back was straight. Her movements were unhurried. She looked like a woman who had already done the hardest part of her day and was now giving herself something to sustain her through whatever came next. She turned and looked at him. She did not look surprised. She had known, from the moment David Yoon's call ended and she dialed Phyllis Moore, that the lawyer would call Juno before the day was out. She had given herself 3 hours of lead time. She had used them well. "Why didn't you call me?" he asked. His voice was careful, not accusatory. Careful, in the way of a man who knows he is on uncertain terrain and is trying to read the ground before he puts his weight down. "Because," she said, turning back to the stove, "every important call about this company has been made without me. I wanted to see what that felt like from the other side." She picked up the wooden spoon. "It feels like exactly what I expected." He came into the kitchen and stopped a few feet behind her. She could feel him standing there, the particular quality of his stillness when he was holding something in. "Vanessa, I'm not done," she said. "Not loudly. The way you say it when you mean it." He went quiet. She stirred the soup and thought about how many times she had rehearsed this conversation and how none of the rehearsals had included the soup, which had been an impulse, something her body had decided before her mind caught up. She had bought the dried seaweed 3 months ago and it had sat in the pantry untouched. And this afternoon, after Phyllis's voice had said, "You have significance standing here, Vanessa, more than you know," she had come to the kitchen and gotten it down from the shelf without quite deciding to. She turned off the heat. She put 2 bowls on the counter. She ladled soup into both of them, though she had made it for herself, a decision she made in the moment and observed herself making, without judgment. She carried them to the table. She sat. She waited. He sat across from her. She told him about the hanbok in the box in the back of the closet. She told him about the night his Aunt Myung-suk redirected her out of the kitchen. Not the fact of it, which he knew, but what it had felt like to stand in the hallway afterward and hear his family laughing on the other side of the door. She told him about the yellow legal pad. She told him about Gerald Kim saying the Park family's use and the specific physical sensation of that phrase landing in her chest. She did not cry. She reported. Her voice was steady and her hands were flat on the table, and she looked at him directly, the way Ruthie had looked at the man in the brown suit, letting him understand that she was not presenting him with a grievance. She was presenting him with a record. "I have been keeping these things safe," she said, "because I thought someday you would ask about them." She paused. "You never asked." Juno's face had been doing something difficult and private for the last several minutes. He had the look of a man watching a photograph develop, features emerging slowly, the full image becoming clear, and what it showed being harder than what he had imagined. "Tell me what you need," he said. His voice was different than it usually was. Quieter. Scraped down to something underneath the politeness. She looked at him for a long moment. "I need you to be in that room with me," she said. "Not in the middle. Not keeping the peace. Next to me. Whatever that costs you." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the October wind pushed something dry across the patio. Juno looked at his bowl of soup, mayak guk she had made without being asked, for herself, and then served to him anyway. He understood the weight of the gesture. He had been raised to understand it. He looked up at her. He had not answered yet. That was the thing she would carry out of this kitchen. Not whether he would choose her, but the fact that she had finally asked him to. Clearly. Without apology. In her own language and his. Whatever he decided next, she had stopped waiting for him to notice on his own. The Parks called the emergency meeting for a Saturday afternoon. They called it, for the first time, with Vanessa on the invitation. Not because they wanted her there. Because David Yoon had advised Mrs. Park, in terms that left no room for interpretation, that excluding the party whose signature was required from the preliminary discussion would be legally inadvisable and strategically foolish. Mrs. Park had received this information with the stillness of a woman who was accustomed to adjusting her position without letting you see her do it, and she had instructed Gerald Kim to send the meeting invitation to all relevant parties. Vanessa had been in the kitchen when the email arrived. She read it twice. Then she set her phone down and went to her closet and stood in front of it for a while. She wore a charcoal blazer she'd owned for 8 years, Italian wool, bought with the last paycheck from her bank job, the one indulgence she'd allowed herself in the transition. Underneath it, a white shell. Her grandmother's pearl ring on her right hand. Her wedding ring on her left. She did not bring a dish. This was a specific choice. For 11 years she had never arrived at a Park family gathering empty-handed. Had brought sweet potato pie and lemon pound cake and, once, a platter of deviled eggs that Mrs. Park's sister had eaten 3 of while complimenting the store-bought rice cakes. She had brought things because she believed that arriving with something you'd made was a form of language, a way of saying I am trying to speak your dialect of belonging. Today she had nothing in her hands. She intended that to be legible. The Park family home felt different when you entered it knowing what she knew. The ancestor shelf was the same, the row of photographs in their dark frames, the small offering bowl with its dried dates. Mr. Park's portrait in the hallway, the one with the brass nameplate. The hardwood floors that Juno had helped his father refinish the summer after graduate school, a story she'd heard 3 times and still hadn't been part of. She knew this house the way you know a place where you have been a guest so long that you have learned all its rooms and none of its secrets. Mrs. Park was in the living room when Vanessa arrived, already seated, already composed, wearing the charcoal suit that was her equivalent of armor. Around her were arranged Juno's Aunt Myung-suk and her husband, 2 cousins who had shares in the business, and Ji-yeon, who was seated slightly apart from the rest, a distance of perhaps 1 chair, and who looked up when Vanessa walked in with an expression that Vanessa had learned, over years of study, was Ji-yeon's version of attention. David Yoon and Gerald Kim were at the far end of the room with their briefcases open. Juno was not there yet. Vanessa chose a chair, not the one she'd have been guided to in any previous gathering, which was the slight chair near the window, the one with its back to the center of the room, the one that said peripheral. She chose the chair that faced Mrs. Park directly, with a clear sight line to both lawyers, and she sat down, and she put her bag on the floor beside her, and she waited. Juno arrived 4 minutes later. He sat next to her. Not across from her. Not at a neutral remove. Next to her, pulling the chair a half-inch closer to hers before he sat, a movement so small that no one else would have registered it. Vanessa registered it. Mrs. Park's opening remarks were prepared. You could tell by the way she drew a single breath before she began. Not a nervous breath, a gathering breath, the breath of someone who has organized what she is going to say in a specific order and intends to deliver it in that order. She spoke about her husband. She spoke about the early years, the first warehouse in a commercial park in Fairfax, the 14-hour days, the shipments that arrived damaged and had to be resold at a loss, the winter that nearly broke them. She spoke about what Park Industries meant to this family, not as a business but as proof that the Parks had earned their place in this country, had built something that would last, had made the sacrifice of immigration mean something that their children and grandchildren could stand on. It was a formidable speech. It was also addressed to the room as though Vanessa were not in it. Not cruelly, there was no sneer, no pointed exclusion. It was more precise than that. Mrs. Park spoke to her family the way you speak when you are reminding a circle of people who belong to it, and the reminder itself is the boundary. Every we in the speech referred to a group whose membership had never formally included Vanessa and was not being revised today. Every invocation of sacrifice referred to sacrifices Vanessa had not been present for. The speech was its own kind of wall, built not of hostility but of history, of all the years that had happened before Vanessa existed in this family story. When she finished, the room was quiet. Then David Yoon began to speak about the investor deadline. 48 hours, he said, and the word hours landed in the room with the specific weight of a clock. After that point, the acquisition would proceed on terms the family could not control. Park Industries would survive, but the Parks would be minority stakeholders in their own company. Everything Mrs. Park had just described, the sacrifice, the proof, the legacy, would be administered by people who did not know those stories and would not have been moved by them if they did. The room shifted. Something tightened. Vanessa let the silence following Yoon's summary extend for 3 full seconds. Then she said, without raising her voice, "Thank you for that history. I've been part of this family for 11 years, and I didn't know some of those stories." She let that register. "I have a folder here with some history of my own, if anyone's interested in the complete picture." No one responded. She opened the folder anyway. From across the room, in the slightly separate chair, Ji-yeon said, "Let her talk." It was 4 words. Ji-yeon said them without drama, without looking at her mother, in the conversational tone of someone stating what should already be obvious. But the effect was the effect of a seam splitting. The family's unified front, which had held for 11 years, developed a visible line. Mrs. Park looked at her daughter. Ji-yeon looked at Vanessa. Vanessa began. The meeting had been going for 90 minutes when Mrs. Park made the mistake. The lawyers had recessed briefly. A phone call David Yoon needed to take, a document Gerald Kim needed to locate in his briefcase, and the room had the particular looseness of a formal proceeding on pause. People shifted in their chairs. Someone went to the kitchen. The structure that had been holding everyone in their professional presentation softened. Just slightly, just enough. Mrs. Park turned to Ji-yeon and spoke in Korean. She did not lower her voice. There was no reason to lower it. She had spoken Korean freely in this house for 40 years, in every room, about every subject, and the habit was so deep it had long since become invisible to her, a reflex as automatic as breathing. What she said, in Korean, was this: "She can sign the papers and then we will handle the rest. She doesn't need to be involved further. Make sure Juno understands that." Ji-yeon did not respond immediately. Her eyes moved, just once quickly, to Vanessa's face. Vanessa was looking out the window, or appeared to be. Mrs. Park waited. Then Vanessa turned from the window and looked at her mother-in-law directly, and in Korean, clear, unhurried, with the particular precision of someone who has been practicing for 3 years not to perform fluency but to understand exactly what is being said in the rooms they are standing in, she said, "Mother, I already stepped back a long time ago. Not anymore." The room stopped. Not metaphorically. The specific physical reality of it, Aunt Myung-suk's hand, which had been moving toward the teapot, went still. One of the cousins looked up from his phone. Gerald Kim, who had returned to his seat, went very quiet. Juno, beside Vanessa, did not move. Mrs. Park looked at Vanessa with an expression that Vanessa had never seen on her face before. Not anger, not embarrassment, but the specific arrested expression of a woman who has just been shown a map of a territory she believes she knew and has found that it is larger than she thought. The silence was not comfortable. It was not meant to be. Then Juno spoke. He spoke in Korean also, and he spoke to his mother, and his voice was not loud and it was not theatrical, but it had a quality that Vanessa had not heard in it before. A quality like a door closing, finally, on a room that had been left open for too long. "She is not a signature. She is my wife. This meeting does not continue until you say that out loud." He did not look away from his mother when he said it. This was the part Vanessa would remember most. Not the words, but that he did not look away. In 11 years of watching him navigate the space between his love for her and his obligation to his family, the thing he had always done in the hardest moments was find something else to look at. The table. His hands. The middle distance. The practiced evasion of a man who had decided long ago that the best he could do was love her privately and manage his family publicly and never force the two into the same room. He was looking at his mother. His mother was looking at him. The cost of what he had just done was visible in the room. Not as drama, but as physics. Something that had been in one position was now in another. You could not put it back. Mrs. Park turned to Vanessa. The silence lasted long enough that Vanessa counted 4 of her own heartbeats. Then Mrs. Park said her name. Not she. Not Juno's wife. Not a pronoun or a title or a careful circumnavigation. Vanessa. Nothing after it. Not an apology, not a welcome, not a speech. Just the name, spoken in Mrs. Park's precise, careful diction, in a room where it had been absent for 11 years. It was not everything. Vanessa knew it was not everything, knew that a name spoken under duress was not the same as a name spoken freely, that this was a beginning and not a resolution, that there was real work ahead that would require more than a single word in a meeting room. But it was the first time. And first times matter, even when they arrive late. David Yoon returned from his phone call to a room that had been reorganized in his absence. He looked around at the altered quality of the silence, at Ji-yeon's face, at Juno's posture, at Mrs. Park, who had returned her hands to their folded position on her lap, but whose eyes had not fully resumed their controlled expression. "Should we continue?" he said. "Yes," Vanessa said. She reached into her folder. She laid 3 documents on the table in front of her. She was ready. The second meeting was in a conference room that Vanessa had chosen and Phyllis Moore had booked. A neutral suite in a law firm in Bethesda, 12 miles from the park house and on no one's home terrain. Vanessa arrived first. She always arrived first. It was a habit from her banking years, from the understanding that whoever sets up the room defines its first impression, and first impressions are not decorative, they are instructional. She placed her folder on the table in front of the center seat. Not the head of the table, the center. She arranged 2 pens beside it. She put a glass of water at her own place. She stood at the window for a moment and looked at the parking lot below, and she thought about her grandmother, and she thought about all the ways you inherit someone. The Parks arrived together, which she had expected. They were a family that moved collectively in moments of uncertainty, drawing close the way organisms do under pressure. Mrs. Park entered first, then Juno, then Ji-yeon, then the 2 cousins, then Gerald Kim with his briefcase. Phyllis Moore was already seated at Vanessa's right. Juno sat beside Vanessa. His shoulder was close to hers. In 11 years of marriage, she had learned the specific grammar of his proximity, when it meant comfort, when it meant apology, when it meant performance. This was not performance. This was a man who had crossed a room and was staying where he'd landed. Phyllis presented the 3 conditions clearly, without preamble. Her voice was the voice of someone who has been waiting a long time to say exactly this and has no interest in softening it. 1. Vanessa's name added, formally and permanently, to the Park Industries Board of Directors, with all rights, access, and documentation that entailed. 2. A retroactive notation in the company's official record, witnessed and filed, acknowledging that the Baltimore warehouse, listed in the company's assets as Linden Industrial, had been brought to the business through Vanessa Caldwell Park, whose beneficial interest had funded the original collateral position. 3. A private meeting between Vanessa and Mrs. Park. 1 hour. Location of Mrs. Park's choosing. Within 30 days. Gerald Kim began to speak. Phyllis raised one hand, not rudely, just with the economical precision of someone directing traffic, and said, "These are not opening positions. They are terms." The cousins exchanged a glance. Aunt Myung-suk, who had come despite not having been required to, looked at Mrs. Park. Mrs. Park read the document. She read it the way she did everything, completely, without rushing, allowing nothing to show on her face. She turned to the second page. She turned to the third. She set it down. She looked at the conditions for a long moment. Then she looked at the notation about the Baltimore warehouse, the second condition, the one that required the company's records to acknowledge what had actually happened, to put Vanessa's name where it had always belonged, and something moved across her face, brief and unguarded. Not shame, exactly, but its first cousin. She reached for her pen. Then she stopped. She looked at Vanessa. "The third condition," she said. "The meeting." A pause. Why? The room was waiting. Phyllis was watching. Juno was still. Vanessa had thought about how she would answer this. She had thought about it at 3 in the morning, lying in the bedroom's dark, Juno asleep beside her. She had thought about it in terms of leverage and strategy and what a woman in her position was entitled to ask for. She had thought about it through every lens available to her. And what she had arrived at was simpler than any of those frameworks. "Because I'm not interested in power over your family," she said. She looked at Mrs. Park directly, the way she always had, the way Mrs. Park had never quite given her credit for. "I'm interested in being part of it. Those are different things." Mrs. Park held her gaze. It was a long moment, the kind you cannot engineer, the kind that either happens or doesn't. Then Mrs. Park signed. All three conditions. She signed them with the unhurried hand of a woman who had made a decision and was going to live inside it. She set the pen down. She did not look at Gerald Kim. She did not look at her cousins. She looked at Ji-yeon, briefly, with an expression Vanessa did not have a name for, and Ji-yeon looked back with one equally unreadable. Then the meeting was over. In the parking lot afterward, Juno walked beside Vanessa to her car and did not speak for a long time. The November air was cold and the sky was the low white of a day that had never quite brightened. "I should have done this 3 years ago," he said. She looked at him. "Yes. I kept thinking, if I managed it right, it would just resolve itself," she said. "I know." She had watched him think this for years. "It doesn't work that way." He was quiet. Then, "I know that now." She looked at him for a moment longer, at the face she had loved for 11 years and been disappointed by and come back to and was still, despite all of it, inclined to believe in. Not blindly. Not the way she had believed in him when she signed the deed. But with the specific, eyes-open belief of a woman who has done the accounting and decided that what remains is still worth something. "Don't do it again," she said. He nodded. She got in her car. She sat for a moment before starting the engine. She was not happy, exactly. She was something more durable than happy. She was clear. The restaurant Mrs. Park chose was in Annandale, on a side street 2 blocks from the Korean grocery where she had shopped for 30 years. It was not a beautiful restaurant. It was the kind of place that had been operating since 1987 and had no interest in being discovered. Red vinyl booths, laminated menus with photographs, a fish tank near the entrance with one listless carp making slow circles. Vanessa arrived first. She had not been to this restaurant before. She had driven past its block a dozen times going to and from the park house, but she had never been inside. This was, she thought, not accidental. There were whole rooms in this family's life she had been adjacent to for 11 years without entering. She was not yet sure how many of them she wanted to enter, now that the door was hers to open. She ordered hot barley tea and sat with it and waited. Mrs. Park arrived 7 minutes later. She wore a navy cardigan and no jewelry except small pearl earrings and the simple gold band she had worn since 1974. She looked, without the armor of the charcoal suit, like a woman in her 70s who was tired in a way that sleep did not fully address. She sat across from Vanessa and looked at the menu for a moment, though Vanessa suspected she had not needed a menu here in 15 years. They ordered. The food came. For a while they ate without speaking, which was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of 2 women who did not need to fill space and knew it. Then Mrs. Park set down her chopsticks. "When Seongmin and I first opened the business," she said, "we shared one desk. In the back of a warehouse in Fairfax. We could not afford 2 chairs. She looked at the table. The vendors would call and I could hear in their voices that they did not expect us to still be there in a year." She paused. "We were there for 31 years. Vanessa listened. Mrs. Park described things she had not described in the meeting room. Not the legacy, not the sacrifices argument, but the texture of it. The specific cold of that first warehouse in January. Her husband's hands coming home rough from moving inventory. Juno, age 6, doing his homework on a folding table in the corner because there was no after-school program they could afford and no family nearby to watch him. Ji-yeon, 4 years later, learning to crawl between the storage shelves. She did not embellish. She was not asking for sympathy. She was giving Vanessa something. Not an explanation for her behavior, not a justification, but a context. The kind of context that requires trust to offer. Vanessa accepted it as what it was. When she finished, Vanessa told her about Ruthie. Not the warehouse, not the deed, not the legal structure. She told her about the woman. About the oilcloth table and the survey in the pocket of the house robe. About the 5 nights a week for 31 years. About the way Ruthie moved through the world with the specific, undemonstrative authority of a woman who had never waited for permission and never expected credit and never stopped building. She told me, Vanessa said, never put your name on something you don't intend to own. She looked at her tea. I forgot that for a while. Mrs. Park was quiet for a moment. The fish tank hummed near the entrance. The carp made another slow circuit. Your grandmother was a smart woman, Mrs. Park said. It was not an apology. It was not a declaration of changed feeling. It was a compliment. The first Mrs. Park had offered Vanessa in 11 years, and it had the quality of something that cost something. A woman like Mrs. Park did not say you were smart unless she believed it. And she had watched Vanessa for 11 years and arrived, in a small restaurant in Annandale in November, at the conclusion that this woman she had kept at arm's length was someone worth the compliment. Vanessa held it carefully. She did not let herself want it to be more than it was. She would have liked you, Vanessa said, which was also true, which was the most she had to offer and was enough. Mrs. Park looked at her for a moment. Then she reached for the ceramic pot that the server had left on the table and poured tea into Vanessa's cup. She poured it first, before her own. She set the pot down without comment. Vanessa looked at the cup. 11 years of empty cups, of reaching for the pot herself, of the specific discipline of not reacting to the gesture that said you are adjacent but not included. 11 years, and now this, a cup poured for, set down without ceremony, without production, without apology. Just done, the way you do things for family. She picked it up. She drank. 6 months after the Bethesda meeting, on a Tuesday morning in April, Vanessa unlocked the door of her office at Park Industries and turned on the lights. The office was on the 3rd floor. It had a window that faced east, so the morning came in clean and direct, and today it came in clean and direct and fell across the surface of her desk in a long rectangle of light that moved, over the course of the morning, from one edge to the other. She had learned this about the room over the last 6 months, the way you learn things about spaces that belong to you. Slowly, without trying. On her desk, her laptop, a legal pad, 2 pens, the framed photograph of Ruthie that she had brought from home on her first day and placed where she would see it when she looked up. In the photograph, Ruthie was 44, not much older than Vanessa was now, standing in front of the Baltimore warehouse with her hands on her hips and an expression that was not a smile, exactly, but something adjacent to satisfaction. The expression of a woman who has built something and is standing in front of it. On the door of the office, in the frosted glass panel beside the handle, her name. V. Caldwell Park. It had been there for 6 months and she still touched it sometimes when she arrived, briefly, with 2 fingers, the same gesture you make to confirm that a thing is real. The company's restructuring had closed successfully. The acquisition had been blocked. Park Industries had a new investor, a Korean-American development group out of Atlanta whose lead partner had, Vanessa noted, called her directly to discuss the terms. She had sat in that call with Phyllis's notes in front of her and had conducted it with the fluency of a woman who had spent 7 years in commercial lending and another 11 years paying careful, unwanted attention to a family business, and the lead partner had said, at the end of the call, "I look forward to working with you, Ms. Caldwell Park," and she had said, "Likewise," and meant it without reservation. The press release had been drafted by Ji-yeon. This was not an accident. Ji-yeon had asked to draft it. She had sent it to Vanessa before sending it to anyone else in the family, with a note that said only, "Tell me if anything needs correcting." Vanessa had read it carefully, and it had not needed correcting, and she had written back, "It's right." And Ji-yeon had sent it out. In the section on company history, under the founding of the Baltimore subsidiary, the press release read, "The Linden Industrial Facility, which anchors the company's East Coast distribution network, was established through a founding investment by board member Vanessa Caldwell Park." Her name. In the company's official history. In the record that would exist after the meeting rooms were empty and the lawyers were gone and everyone who had been in that Bethesda conference room had moved on to other mornings. She had read that sentence 3 times the day it was released. She had not cried. She had gone to her office and sat at her desk and looked at Ruthie's photograph and let the sentence be true without making it into something larger than it was, because making it larger would mean treating it as unexpected, and she had not built 11 years of quiet, careful record-keeping in order to be surprised by being right. She was reviewing a contract at 11:30 when Juno knocked on the open door. He did this sometimes. Came to her office in the late morning on the days they were both in the building. There was something in it she was still getting used to, the visibility of their partnership in a space that had once excluded her, the way the company's administrative staff had adjusted without comment to the reality that the board included her and that her husband sat beside her in meetings rather than representing the family as a singular unit. These were not nothing, these adjustments. They were evidence of a changed landscape, and she moved through them with the same attention she had always paid to things that mattered and that no one was watching her notice. He came in and sat across from her, in the guest chair, which was the only available chair, and she registered the geometry of it without comment, because sometimes the room's arrangements tell a story that doesn't need help. He said, "I've been trying to figure out how to tell you something for a while." She set her pen down. "When you signed the deed," he said. He stopped. He started again, the way you do when you have rehearsed something and found, in the moment, that the rehearsal is insufficient. "When you signed the deed, I knew the agreement was informal. I knew it should have been done properly. I knew because you said so, and I told you Gerald would fix it, and He looked at his hands. "I didn't follow up. I told myself I would, and I didn't. And then I told myself it didn't matter because it was all family anyway." His voice had lost something. The professional cadence that he wore in the building, the posture of the eldest son who runs the meeting and holds the room together, it had gone. What was left was a register she heard primarily in private, in the hours that belonged only to them. "I let you carry the risk of my negligence," he said. "For 4 years. And then when the risk surfaced, the first thing I did was walk into the kitchen and stand in the doorway and ask why you hadn't called me." He shook his head. Once, slowly. "I am sorry for that. I'm sorry I didn't do what I said I'd do. I'm sorry it took." He stopped again. Vanessa looked at him. "Say the number," she said. He looked up. "How many years?" He held her gaze. 11 years, he said. "I'm sorry it took 11 years. His voice, saying it, had the sound of something that had been held under pressure for a long time and had finally been allowed to release. Not explosively, but with a slow, irreversible quality of pressure equalizing. He was not performing contrition. He was simply, at last, in the same room as the truth. She was quiet for a moment. "I know," she said. "I believe you." A pause. "Keep going." He had not expected that. She saw it in his face, the slight recalibration. He had prepared for one outcome and was being invited into a different one. "Keep going," she said again. Not permissively. As instruction. As the statement of a woman who had not spent 11 years paying attention in order to accept a single apology as settlement. She was not closing a chapter. She was continuing one, with amended terms, with both eyes open, as a partner. He understood. She watched him understand it. "Okay," he said. She was still at her desk at 4 in the afternoon when her phone rang. A number she didn't recognize. Maryland area code. "Is this Vanessa Caldwell Park?" A young woman's voice. Slightly breathless, the way voices get when someone has talked themselves into making a call and is still not sure they should have. "It is," Vanessa said. "My name is Camille. Camille Reyes Watanabe. I got married 8 months ago. My husband's family has a business. And there were some documents at the beginning that I signed because I trusted. I thought." She stopped. Gathered herself. "Someone gave me your name. They said you were the person to call." Vanessa pulled the legal pad toward her. She picked up a pen. Ruthie in the kitchen. The man with the folder. The survey in the pocket. Keep track, she had written, 4 years ago in a kitchen drawer, and she had kept track, and the keeping had brought her here. To this desk, to this name on this door, to this phone, to this young woman on the other end of it who was standing, 8 months in, at a doorway that Vanessa recognized. She had not won. She had learned. And there was a difference between those two things that most people never get far enough to understand. "Tell me," she said. "Start from the beginning. Tell me exactly what you signed." Outside the east-facing window, The afternoon light had moved all the way across her desk and reached the far wall, and the room was full of it, warm and flat and specific, and she sat in it with the pen in her hand and the legal pad open and her grandmother's face in the photograph looking at her with that expression that was not quite a smile but was something more useful. The expression of a woman who has built something and knows it will hold. This channel exists for the woman who kept the record when no one was watching. For the woman who stayed gracious past the point where grace was being honored, and eventually decided she had been gracious long enough. For the woman who built something real and watched other people stand on it without saying her name, until the day she said it herself. If this story found you, it found you for a reason. Subscribe. Come back. Every story here was written for women who already know these truths and needed to hear them told out loud. Thank you for watching Afro Korean Tales and Stories. As we close this story, I want to say something to the women watching. Some of you have lived through moments like this. Moments where you had to stand alone. Moments where you chose dignity over comfort. Moments where you refused to be bought, silenced, or pushed aside. That kind of strength doesn't always make noise, but it changes rooms. If you are a woman who believes respect is worth more than money, if you believe character still matters, if you believe dignity should never be negotiated, then this channel was made for you. I tell stories about women who stand firm. Women who earn respect without begging for it. Women who remind powerful people that integrity cannot be purchased. If that speaks to you, I invite you to subscribe and become part of this community. And if this story touched you, comment the word dignity below. I read your comments, and they help these stories reach more women like you. Until the next story, remember, not every powerful person leads with honor, but every strong woman carries it within her. I'll see you in the next one.